high level. I mean, these were three. We need to click this button here. These were 3 extensive lectures, but they boiled down to the following observations. So firstly, machine learning is about defining some optimization target and using an expressive function. And nowadays, neural networks with many hidden parameters are a very good expressive function for this task. And we just minimize this loss function on the data using backpropagation and gradient descent. Then we talked quite extensively about encoding our knowledge, encoding what we know about the data, encoding what we know about physics. So anything we can get into the problem that makes the machine learning task easier, to put this primarily into the architecture, so in the way the weights in the network are structured. And then yesterday, we talked about building what I call here complex optimization targets, but essentially trying to tell the network exactly what kind of solution we want by, for example, combining a generative and an adversarial network to build new data samples, or by using these tricks like adversarial decorrelation. And in these 3 major themes, we looked at, we spent lots of time with an important supervised problem, namely looking at top quark tagging. And so far, we've explored 2 very big generative architectures: generative adversarial networks and normalizing flows that you saw in David's lecture yesterday. Today, for the last part of my lecture at least, I want to introduce one more generative architecture, because there are really 3 important generative models. And the third one will be called variational autoencoders. And they fit very nicely in with the theme that we can, on the one hand, use them for simulating detectors. So now we learned all about these generative models, so we at least should see in action how well they really do on a specific physics problem. And then we'll talk about anomaly detection. So essentially the question of can we discover new physics, or can we discover any phenomenon in data without explicitly specifying what we want to look for from the get-go. And I think David will further elaborate on both of these themes. Oops, it really does not like me. Okay. So to start you off with a cheat sheet, so if you ever want to quickly remember the 3 generative architectures, the generative adversarial networks we had yesterday, and the basic principle is that we have a generator that maps some latent variables that are randomly distributed into stuff that looks like real samples, and that we have a discriminator that compares between real and fake examples. The normalizing flow is a bit of a different structure. If we want to go back the full way, whoops, I'm very sorry, okay, nothing happened. It actually consists of 2 parts. So if you run the flow in the forward direction, you can map from examples in data space, so from images, from data points that you measured, into a latent space with a well-defined probability distribution. And we're going to use the fact that the probability distribution in the latent space is well-defined. We're going to use that quite extensively, especially for anomaly detection. And an interesting property of the normalizing flow is it's completely invertible, which means the dimensionality of the latent space is exactly the same as the dimensionality of the data space. So this is really a one-to-one bijective mapping, which means if we run the flow in the inverse direction, we can map from the latent space back to the data space. And since this is invertible, x prime and x for normalizing flow are exactly the same. A variational autoencoder, and we'll build it up a bit more slowly, but we can already look at where we will end up. You can think of as something similar to a normalizing flow, with the big difference that the forward direction and the backward direction are not exact inverses of each other. So in a normalizing flow, we have an encoder that maps from a data space to a latent space, and a decoder that maps from a latent space back to the data space. But here, in the flow, these were 2 exact mathematically constructed pieces of functions that are sure to be inverses of each other. In this case, this is just 2 independently trained networks, so there's no guarantee they're exact inverses, which has some downsides, but which also has the upside that the latent space dimension does not to be as large or as small as the data space dimension. So there's a bit more freedom in here, and we'll actually use that to our advantage in a bit. So let's build it up. And to look at the variational autoencoder, we first should understand how a non-variational autoencoder works. And then we'll introduce the variational bit. So autoencoder, as I said, at its core is a structure that maps from the data space, here with this very nice kitten. There is one network that maps to the latent space, which we call the encoder. Could be a convolution in this case if we work with images. And there's a second network, could be a decoder, that we call the decoder, that maps back to the data space. Again, I've said that several times. I know we're on a very steep learning curve here. I also by now know that some of you are actually much more advanced, so maybe you're actually happy with this curve. But I just want to emphasize again. Whenever I draw a box like this and say this is some network with some properties, in your mind, just visualize this as a fully connected network with a couple of nodes and a couple of layers. And in this case, it will have as many inputs as the image has pixels, and as many outputs as you choose for in the latent space. But these are still differentiable functions, and we can still train them via backpropagation and gradient descent. And you know by now that when you train via backpropagation and gradient descent, the most important ingredient is the loss function. So for the autoencoder, what do you want for the loss function? You want the autoencoder to produce an output that is as close as possible to the input. So the loss function should be some measure of difference between the output and the input. And for these images, a very simple solution is just to take, again, the mean squared error that you heard about in the first lecture. And this is what is written here. So y hat is just the output. Whoops. So we applied, this should not be a y hat, this can just be an x. I need to fix this equation, I'm sorry. So it's really x minus g of f of x squared. So it's really this pixel-wise difference between the input and the output. I was confused. I'm very sorry that there's a y hat there, I don't know. I pasted the wrong equation. So it's x minus g of f of x. So the encoder, we call the function f here, applied to the data, and then we apply the decoder to the encoder. And you can see, since f and g, so the decoder and the encoder are differentiable functions. If we build a composite function like that, of course, this is still a differentiable function, and we can still backpropagate through it as we were doing with the simpler networks. Okay. We understand now how we build an autoencoder, but now we should think about why this is actually a good idea. Because, of course, if I have a function that I put something in and I get the same thing back out, I'm wasting my time. What's the benefit if I get exactly the same thing in as I put out? I could just keep the thing that I had in the beginning and would not need to bother with putting this in a neural network. So there are 2 or 3 applications that we can think of. The first one is the observation that, as I said, opposed to a normalizing flow, the latent space has a smaller dimension than the data space. This means this autoencoder learns a compression. It learns, like a zip algorithm, to compress the data to a smaller amount of bits, with the big difference that the zip algorithm is a lossless compression algorithm. So if you zip a file and you unzip it, you get the same file back. With an autoencoder, it's actually a lossy compression, so it's more like MP3 or JPEG. You compress down the image to a smaller representation that the network needs to learn which properties of the data are important about. And we can use this compressed representation, for example, by saying if we have a task where we care about reducing the data size, one could store the latent vector instead of the data and save a bit of space. So this is the example of the dimension reduction. Another property is that if there's noise in the original image, but you train such an autoencoder on images without noise, then hopefully the encoder would learn to remove the noise when you map to the latent space, and when you map back to the data space, you've denoised your image. So if artifacts in your image data are a problem, this might be an interesting approach. We will need to work a bit more to use the autoencoder for generation, so we keep that in the backs of our mind, and very soon we'll also encounter it for the task of anomaly detection. I need to take a sip, and if you have questions on autoencoders, I think it's a good time to ask, because there is a slightly different concept of network, because we're training them in a different way than we've trained anything else so far.
The size of this latent space is arbitrary, that is like
the size of the latent space is essentially a free hyperparameter. There are good choices and bad choices depending on the problem, but it's completely free hyperparameter.
Okay, and is this also possibility to have to use this autoencoder for the pile-up removal, or
pile-up removal?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. This is what type of denoising application people have been thinking about. Like you train it on data without pile-up, and then if you apply it to data without pile-up, you need to show that the pile-up is actually removed by the encoder because it has never seen it, and if you then reconstruct it back, you have the event without pile-up. I don't think it's working as well as, let's say, more specific pile-up removal techniques, but mentally this is a possible application, yes. Okay, let's move on, and let's maybe think for a moment. Because if we look at this autoencoder, the latent space is again a set of variables that if I map from the latent space to the data space, I should be able to generate images, because that's exactly what's happening. This is an abstract representation. These are realistic images. So why can't I use the autoencoder as a generative model? What's the problem there? Does anybody have an idea? No? Okay. Well, in the normalizing flows, we define the latent space to follow a probability distribution that we understand well. We start with Gaussians. In the generative adversarial network, we also start with Gaussian random noise. The problem with the naive autoencoder like that is that we have no idea into what shape in the latent space the data will actually end up. So you don't know what shape the data will cover, which means you don't know which random distribution you need to sample from. If you don't know the distribution you need to sample from, you can't use it as a generative model. Because if you sample Gaussian, but in fact, half of the latent space that you would sample with the Gaussian is not populated by realistic images, then you'll only produce random images or noise here. So you need to be a bit smarter about that. And the first proposal going in that direction is the so-called variational autoencoder. So as I said, we want to have the latent space under control. This is really the mission we're setting out here to do. We want to shape the latent space in a way that we can easily sample from it. And one strategy is to split up the latent space into two parts and use it to parameterize a probability distribution that we actually know and understand. So this would be a Gaussian distribution. So you can consider the latent space now structured into two halves. One half we treat as the means of Gaussian distributions, so the parameter mu in the Gaussian. The other half we treat as the standard deviations. So each latent space variable then describes one Gaussian distribution. So essentially you can think of the encoder network then having the job of decomposing this image into a set of Gaussian shaped random variables. This is bringing us one step closer to where we want to be, because now we sample from these Gaussian distributions before we feed this into the decoder network. But now we know at this point the data that we sample from is distributed according to Gaussian distributions. This is great. We're very good at sampling from Gaussian distributions. So this brings us one step closer to being able to use the autoencoder as a generative network. The problem is, it still can learn arbitrary Gaussian distributions at that point, meaning that the mu and the sigma have an arbitrary degree of freedom. The next step in this setup is to actually force the latent space to be relatively closely distributed to Gaussian distributions with a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So we not only want Gaussian distributions, we want Gaussian distributions with a specific property. Remember again the normalizing flows. With the normalizing flows, we're doing the same thing. But in the normalizing flow, you start from the Gaussian distribution mentally and you go to the other way. But here, we really say we want our encoder network to learn in such a way that everything is mapped in a meaningful way, that on average, it's distributed according to Gaussian distributions in the latent space. And we are very good by now at telling our network what we want it to do. This means you by now know when I have a problem that I want to change the way my network behaves, I add a term to the loss function. So this is the loss function of the autoencoder, and again, I'm very sorry for putting a y prime here. This should y hat here. This should really just be an x, and we add an extra term, and it's not quite obvious why this corresponds to the Gaussian mean 0 with 1, but it's like a several line proof that you can reproduce. I have the paper linked at some later point, but essentially this extra term here enforces or encourages the specific values for the Gaussian distribution, and that is all we need. So now we can train this whole chain, and this is called a variational autoencoder, and force the variables into a specific distribution. So as I said, we're in the very beginning, and there are many confusing boxes, so let me try to make this a bit more concrete. We can imagine a variational autoencoder look the following way. We have a 2-layer dense network where one layer has 500 nodes and one layer has 120 nodes. And this layer with 120 nodes then produces 60 outputs. 30 of them we treat as a mean, 30 of them we treat as a standard deviation. This allows us to sample 30 Gaussian distributions. So at this point, we have 30 random variables that we sample from. We use them as an input to another dense network with 120 layers, and to a dense network with 500 layers, and we get the output. And then we compare the input to the output, plus this extra term that conditions the shape in the latent space. So I hope this is a relatively concrete way of looking at that. We can even look at it more concretely. So we have a couple of output numbers, 0.1, 1.2, blah, 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 and output standard deviations at this point. Then we sample the first Gaussian distribution, normal distributed with mean 0.1, standard deviation 0.2, all of them. And this gives us this sampled vector, and this is just in a list of numbers that we use to feed in to the second dense network.
I have a question. So the size of the mu and sigma should be same as this latent space?
Yes.
And second question, it should be always the symmetric?
The same, sorry?
It should be always the symmetric. It's 500, 120, and so on, and 120 and 500.
It does not need to be symmetric, but it's very usual to construct it in a symmetric way. Because you're thinking of your funneling down information and then you're building up information again. So that's why it's mentally very tempting to build it that way. And very often works, but there is no guarantee. I don't, at least, maybe there are guarantees that I'm not aware of, but there's no hard statement that it needs to be. But sorry? So it works. I think that's the answer, yes. Okay, so let's look at the latent space. This is 2 examples that we can do with variational autoencoders. The first one is looking at the MNIST data set, and we're very well acquainted with the MNIST data set by now. And so we can look at 3 different combinations: the first, the second, and the third. The left one is just training with the reconstruction loss. So just training with this difference term, but without training with the extra term that forces the shape of the Gaussian distributions. And the latent space has projected down to 2 variables here, and we can look, each of the colored points represents one of the 10 digits. So we can see here the region of 1s, the region of 2s, that's the purple stuff up here, and so on. So the network really learns to arrange the data in a very nice shape in the latent space, but we see already that this latent space is not Gaussian distributed, and it's very irregular shape. So if you were just uniformly or Gaussianly sampling from this, you would have a very hard time. And the other observation that people make in this paper is that here transitions across the latent space very often are actually not covered by meaningful transformations. We can look also at the second version. How would the latent space look if we only train with the Gaussian loss term, but not with the reconstruction loss? Well, then the network is not at all encouraged to shape the latent space into a nice distribution. What instead does is put everything into one big random cluster, but of course the reconstruction performance of this will be very bad because we're not even asking it to learn to reconstruct. We're just asking it to turn anything that it sees into two random numbers that are Gaussian distributed. Combined latent space then is nicely shaped, but still has these good properties.
So it is an example that is flattening from the beginning, or CNN and then flattening?
No, I think this is three independent. This is three independent trainings with the one loss, with the other loss, and with
no,
both.
What I mean that is from the beginning. So when you put this data,
yeah,
it's flattened as a, or it's a convoluted and flattened.
I actually don't know for this specific result. The MNIST data set is small enough that you could either do it with the fully connected or with the convolutional one that you flatten in between. Both should work for that. You can use convolution, but you're right, you need to flatten before you go here. You at some point need to flatten. I mean, you probably could think of some way of doing this with convolutions, but I'm not aware of that. So I would assume that you flatten here before you go into the sampling. Okay. Yes?
They are the point of the mean. Are they the point of the mean?
I think these are the sampled points.
Sample point, but in the latent space.
Yes.
But you have the mean information and the variance information, and they are just mean points.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you have any idea of some shape of the variance?
No, I actually don't think it's the mean points. I think it's the sampled points already.
Yeah, but for one sample, you're going to have one mean and one variance.
No, sorry, after sampling from the Gaussian. If you sample from the Gaussian, you have 1 point sample from it. Okay, it will on average be close to the mean. So I think I understand what you're asking, but I don't have an answer for this. So this is not a study that we have done ourselves. So it's an interesting question. I don't know, you probably have a better answer on this than I do.
No, I don't have an answer for that.
Okay.
Actually, I'm just curious that if they are the mean point of each input, then what is the shape of the variance for each point? That is actually my question.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, but I don't have an answer to it.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I mean, this is something on MNIST data. We can talk afterwards. We've done something similar ourselves on physics data, where we can learn. Let me show you the plots afterwards. Maybe not for this lecture, but this is interesting if you care about that. Okay, and the final thing is that this is also a bit older result, but it shows quite nicely that if you have different images in latent space, you can actually in some cases identify directions in latent space that correspond to specific transformations on the image, and then move along these directions to do different transformations to the image. I mean, these all look very blurry, but I think you can see the bigger picture here. So of course, this is very interesting if we're thinking a bit far-fetched about physics application, and we manage to map physics data into a latent space. Actually, I can bring a brief example here, which some colleagues are working on. So, trying to improve the modeling of simulated photon showers. You could train a variational autoencoder on electron showers and also on some photon showers, but if you're able to find the right direction in the latent space to turn an electron into a photon, this is one way people have been thinking about it, to model one particle, morph one particle into another. There are now, I think, better tools on the market, like a cycle gun, but this was an early idea of what one could do with a variational autoencoder. Okay, let's look at the specific application example. And the main motivation that I got into generative models is the computing bottleneck. So this is a breakdown taken from Atlas. Just compared to CMS, they're a bit better at publishing these nice pie charts of where the computing time goes. But the CMS situation is maybe a bit less severe, but very similar. So a large chunk of the computing budget of the large LHC experiments, and since a large fraction of you is from the theory community, maybe I should emphasize this. We're talking here really about data centers with millions of CPU hours running day and night to not only process the actual data we receive from the experiments, but to run the simulations. And we need approximately as much simulation data as we have actual collision data. So for example, the CMS backlog on events that needs to produce is in the billions of events, and we're really struggling to keep up the production. So, and this might sound very abstract, but of course, if we don't have the simulated events, the physics analysis cannot proceed because you can't analyze the data unless it is understood on the simulation level. So this is really holding back, and is a crucial bottleneck for data analysis at the LHC. And one observation is that a relatively large chunk of the time that goes into simulation is spent in simulating the interaction of particles with calorimeter detectors. I don't want to give a lecture on calorimetry here, but you can imagine the problem the following way. We have an incoming particle, and the modern sampling calorimeter typically consists of two types of material. There is a passive absorber material that really just wants to get the particles to shower, something like steel. And it's interleaved with detectors that actually collect all the particles that shower and measure the energy of everything that it receives. So we have energies deposited here, energies deposited here, energies deposited here. Here is a prototype that's very similar to the type of data we're going to look at in a moment. This is the Calise, I think it's the AH-Cal, so the hadronic calorimeter, the prototype when it was tested at DAISY. You can think of a part of this calorimeter as a chunk of 1 cubic meter roughly, and of course you've seen the pictures of the CMS experiment where the calorimeter is arranged in the outer shell that stops the particles. So we have the shower of secondary particles, and now the goal is to build a generative model that receives a database of such images. We'll see how the images look exactly in a moment, and tries to simulate more of them. And we'll see how this goes. I'm going to show a couple of relatively recent results on this, on a quite complex detector. This direction of investigation was started by the Calogan paper, listed here by Ben Nachman et al. And David will talk a bit more about the Calogan dataset and a few more recent work on that dataset in the second lecture. So there is a bit of switch in timing, but I don't think it's too bad here. Okay, so the concrete problem that I'm going to show a few examples for is a simulation for the international large detector at the linear collider. We're specifically looking at the Electromagnetic Calorimeter, which consists, if we look at one local region of it, of 30 times 30 times 30 cell of silicon tungsten. And we're shooting photons between 10 and 100 GeVs into it. And I think the easiest thing and the thing you should remember to visualize is this type of image. So the data is a 3D image structure. And we can see a bit. So we can see the shower coming in from the left-hand side. We can see it showering here in the material. It fans out a bit. But most of the energy is deposited in the core. You see that because the colors here are a bit brighter and greener. And then there's a bit of energy in the edges. So if we think again of the images of cats and dogs that we typically associate with generative models, then we again face the difficulty that this is a very different type of data. It's sparse. It's fairly high dimensional, but okay, 30 to the power of 3, that's 27,000. That's still far away from megapixels. But the problem is that if, let's say, in a human visible image, I misplace a few pixels, or I get the structure a bit wrong, very often in the visual noise, it will not be such a big problem. Whereas in such a situation, if it's very sparse, it becomes a bit more difficult and it becomes important to really model these distributions correctly. Also, the orders of magnitude that we're talking about here, I'll have that in a moment, these energies really span several orders of magnitude. So it's a bit tricky, and we'll see how that goes. I don't think I need to say anything more about this example. But what I want to show, just to give you a brief moment of shock is the type of architecture that we arrived at for solving this problem. We don't need to understand it in detail, but I want to use it mainly as a showcase because it collects several of the ideas that we've been working on throughout this week. This architecture is based on the BPE, the Bounded Information Bottleneck Autoencoder, developed by the Geneva group, where we added a few bells and whistles on top of it. And the nice thing about the BPE is that combines properties of the generative adversarial network type architecture and the VAE architecture. So let's see if we can find this. The BPAE acts like an autoencoder in the sense that we have an encoder that is fed some input data, projects to a latent space that we sample from, that maps into a decoder. This looks like a VAE. And we also have a KLD divergence term that makes sure that the latent space is unit Gaussian. However, a problem is that when training this with just trying to minimize the mean squared error does not converge so well. So what is actually trained on is a second critic network that tries to distinguish real showers from a database of fake showers. So in that sense, it also has properties of the gamma. In addition to that, there's also a post-processing network and some other stuff. And the loss function you can see as the combination of all of these terms. So it's the classifier type loss function plus the VAE type loss function. You don't need to understand this architecture in detail, and also there will be no exam for this course, but I really just want to give you a flavor of, in a sense, you should think that the tools that we are primarily presenting throughout this week, you can think them of building blocks that you can put together like Lego pieces for the actual problem that you're interested in solving. And this is one example of a very Frankensteinian, but actually quite performant Lego construction that we're doing this way. So we don't need to go too deeply in the results, but an important observation is that in many physics use cases, just looking at the images by eye does not tell you anything. So this is an example of a training image. These are 3 examples of different generative architectures. They do all look equal because we're just not used to see by eye any properties that should be relevant. So what is typically used to analyze this physics data is to look at differential distribution, and here we can see that it works. We don't need to stare at this plot too long, but you see it covers, for example, in particle energies, 2 orders of magnitude. And the final, let's say, no, there's 2 final points I want to make on this example. The first one is that we indeed see, if we now compare the time it takes to sample 100 examples on average from this BPE on the GPU, compare it to running the traditional simulation on the CPU, we get a speed up on the order of 3 orders of magnitude. So this is the direction we want to be headed in. Of course, there are many caveats before such a model can go into production. So one needs to take into account the time it needs for interfacing. One would also need to study how the equivalent performance per dollar, for example, would be. There is still a bit of work on this road, but it's, I think what I like to say, it's encouraging and these things go in the right direction. There is 2 more comments I wanted to make about these results or about this line of study. The first one is that it's important to keep in mind that to use such a generative model, actually it is necessary to also have available a set of training data to work with. So all these generative architectures still rely on geosimulated data as an input, and we can't get around that. Well, you can think if it's possible to train directly on recorded data, but this is a bit more difficult because if we want to condition, for example, on the particle energy, this is not something very easily done if you do it in an actual detector. Yes, Casey?
So why the green distribution has a kind of peak to the slightly left side of the bump? Do you know the difference between these distributions?
Yes, I do. Thank you for asking. I did not want to talk about it, but I'm very happy to if you ask. because this is the main breakthrough of that paper, actually. So what we show is the visible cell energy. So essentially the amount of energy recorded in each cell in the detector. So essentially each colorful pixel here gets one entry in the histogram. Okay. So we have 4 lines representing G4, so the underlying simulation in gray. A simple generative adversarial network, a W-gun, you heard about both of these yesterday. And this slightly more complex architecture that I talk about. And so we want to mimic this distribution of G4 examples as well as we can. And G4 has this relatively sharp drop off here at that energy at around, well, we can have it actually here at around 1 MIP. So that is the energy that corresponds to the energy deposited by one minimally ionizing particle in this type of calorimeter. And this is a relatively sharp edge in this distribution. And the simple gun and the simple W gun were not able to learn it. And the BPE, I mean, we kept adding up all these different generative models until it was able to manage this dip, because this is a physically important feature of the data that is not easy to model. Okay, thanks for this question. I wanted to briefly talk about something else, because I don't want to say I've been lying to you, but I've been leaving out a bit of truth. There's one other important aspect with generative models. I've said that we add the KLD term to bring the mean and the sigma as close as possible to 0 and 1, so we can sample from it. It turns actually out there is an even smarter way of doing that. Instead of enforcing this to be close to 0, very close to 0 and 1, with a very strong term for the KLD in the loss function, so with a very high beta KLD to give this term lots of weight, we can actually relax that a bit and have it maybe pushed a bit towards 0 and 1. And instead, once the generative model is trained and we can project data into the latent space, train a second density estimator in the latent space. Because as I said, the whole point of this whole variational autoencoder construction is to build a latent space that we can sample from. And we can do this 2 ways. We can either force it to have exactly the distribution we want it to be, and then we can sample from it. Or alternatively, we enforce it a bit less, then learn the distribution it has actually learned. And as I said, this can be a much simpler density estimator like a kernel density-based model. So the simpler techniques then start to work, because the encoder already does the heavy lifting of turning the physical shapes into something that is very close to Gaussians. And then sample once from the first density estimator to get the shape in the latent space, and then run the latent space through the decoder. It's one extra piece of software you need to involve. On the other hand, it produces much nicer results. And this is the plots I showed. So this is a strategy to remember in general when dealing with generative models, maybe not flows, but variational autoencoders, that overly enforcing the KLD might not be the ideal strategy. Okay, let's see where we stand in terms of generative modeling. So there is a number of open questions that are slowly and or more faster being worked on. And one of them is very importantly, again, how can we evaluate, how can we quantify how good a generative model is? Because if we look at the data by eye, it's okay. If we do something like I did here, that we pick out a handful of physics distributions we care about, that is fine as well, but it feels not elegant in a sense. So trying to come up with methods to better judge the quality of generative models is an important thing, and David, I think, will be talking about the classifier-based metric to judge this. Then specifically for physics application, of course, many distributions need to be modeled at the same time. We need to be able to explicitly simulate by energy, by particle type, by impact position, and so on. We need to interface this with actual software and the usual generative modeling consideration. So this is, I think, an interesting direction that is moving along, but it still needs a bit of work. So as a last statement on generative models, I want to bring up a point that is very controversial, And that's an interesting discussion. Namely, so I've explained that the generative model is something we train on a data set of initial examples, and then we use it to generate more data. Now there is a potential problem. If we want to use this to amplify traditional simulations, we assume that we, for example, train the generative model on 100 images, and then we sample much more images from the generative model. You could think we train on 100 images, and then we sample 1,000 images from the generative model. Okay. This feels a bit fishy statistically, or at least it feels like one needs to think about it, because we are sampling more data points than the model was trained on. And this is a line of research that is also just starting. I show here results only for a very simple toy example. We also have some first results on calorimeter data, but I think the toy example already emphasizes the main point. So what we can do is we can take a double peak Gaussian distribution where we know the exact form of the distribution. We can use this to generate training data, then train a neural network on it, then sample from the neural network, and compare the quality of the sampled examples to the training data we did produce. And since we have access for all comparisons to the actual functional form of the distribution we built this from, we can compare the quality analytically, for example, by dividing the distribution in 10 equally sized quantiles, so 10 histogram bins with equal amount of examples for the training data, and then just see how well a sampled histogram, how well the small sample gets to it, and how well the generative model gets to it. And so this is a plot that shows this. So it shows the deviation between the sampled data to the true distribution and the generative adversarial network to the true distribution. And indeed, we see that the more we sample from the generative network, the closer it actually gets to the true distribution, because this line is down, and it surpasses just sampling from the distribution. You can think of this in another way, which ties to what David has said in the first lecture. Machine learning is just glorified curve fitting. So what we do here, we've built a very good curve fitter that, due to the implicit properties of the network, has some smoothness and continuity, is able to understand the smoothness of the shape well enough that we can sample from it. But it's of course not as good as a fit where we actually know that it's a Gaussian shape. But I think this is one aspect that's maybe helpful in thinking about it. Okay, I will take a brief moment, I think, for questions, and then we jump into anomaly detection, which should be the second half of today. Everybody a bit exhausted, I can understand that. Okay, but I hope anomaly detection should be exciting enough. That brings us there, and I need a bit of interaction now. So let's start. Who can tell me where the anomaly in this data set is? Yes? Okay, several people are smiling, or at least I can see they're nodding, so you've spotted the flower cat. Very good. This is what I would call an outlier. It's a data point that is very far away from the regular distribution. So we can imagine it in some two observables. The data is distributed in this way, and the anomaly might be a couple of data points that lie around there somewhere in the middle. How would this map to LHC physics? Well, if a detector misfunctions and all the parts of the calorimeter light up at once, that's a typical thing you would see as an outlier. And there's a class of searches where there's a very low amount of background predicted from theory, just because the standard model should never be in that part of phase space. That would also be an outlier of that kind. I think it's an interesting type of anomaly, but not the most interesting anomaly that we can care about for developing machine learning techniques, because these are comparatively easy to find. But who can tell me where the anomaly on this image is? And I'm not going to go forward until I have at least one answer. So somebody needs to put themselves out there. Top right? Why? Ah, interesting. Okay, other suggestions? Everybody agree that the top right is the anomaly? Shaking your heads, okay. Do we have alternative suggestions? You have something? No. Okay. Sorry?
The one like which has a lot of sort of like petals.
This one? Okay. I'm sorry. I don't really know about flowers. I just Googled flower by different color and always took the first hit on Google Images. So they are all a bit different flowers, but we don't care for that. What we can do, however, is we can sort the images by their color. In particle physics application, we would in the end sort them by invariant mass or by energy, whatever, but we sort the flowers per color, and we just look at the count, at the number of flowers of each specific color. So essentially what we're doing is we're making a very simple histogram, and we see we have 2 red flowers, 2 orange flowers, 2 yellow flowers, 2 green flowers, but 4 blue, and then again 2 violet. So the anomaly, very important, the anomaly is not an individual example. I mean, you know, if you stare at it, each flower has some of its own properties that maybe make it interesting, but really what counts is not the individual outlierness of the individual data points, but the fact that we're observing an interesting collective behavior of these data points. And this type of anomaly is interesting for physics problems, because if we're searching for new physics in the form of a resonance, it will be exactly like that. Let me explain this plot again. Monday is now a long time ago, but several of these things I talk about echo things that are in the seminar by Ben, because we have been thinking about similar things and working together on some of them. So several of these things you might already feel familiar, but maybe it's now a different way of seeing things now that you had one lecture of machine learning, 1 week of machine learning basics lectures. So let's revisit a few of these things, but of course I'll be quick with the things that you already should know. So the first observation we make is if we look at this distribution, this is invariant mass distribution of some signal. A physics signal would have a background distribution that is red, this red distribution that is relatively smoothly falling. And we have a signal-like distribution that is localized and that peaks at one specific value. So we've already split off a signal region, and this is this blue peak here. And it's very important to understand what we talk about in the following, that we only draw one dimension, but of course the data we care about has much higher dimensionality. So if it's a simple physics example, you could imagine that we also measure the ends-up jettiness that we introduced actually, or some other quantity of the event like the number of leptons or the missing energy, whatever you want. And this is indicated by these other bars up there. But at least in one variable, the signal is resonant. So building on this, we can think of 2 possible strategies to look for anomalies. The first strategy involves, or let's put it differently, the choice which strategy you want to use involves the question whether, for a specific problem, there is good simulation available to estimate how the backgrounds behave. If this good simulation is available, then you could say, okay, I just systematically compare across all my data set the simulation with the data, and if I find a spot where the simulation and the data don't agree, I have found new physics, I found an anomaly. It's a perfectly viable strategy. It's been carried out by the CMS and Atlas collaboration. Inside CMS, this is called music. Inside Atlas, it's called a model, I always forget it, model unspecific searches or something like that, a generic search. And the big advantage is that this type of approach is sensitive to basically all types of anomalies. The big disadvantage is that you maximally rely on the quality of the simulation. And of course, we always say simulation in LHC physics is good, but it's, you Usually not good enough that you don't find rather problems in the simulation instead of new physics with this approach. The alternative is to try to get rid of simulation as far as possible. The downside that we'll have is that we'll need to make some assumptions about the behavior of the signal to make a background estimation work, but the big advantage is that such an approach will not rely on having so good simulation. And because we are very excited about this type of problem, Ben, David, and I started the Lhc Olympics to tackle this. So all anomaly detection that I'm going to talk about, and I think also what you're talking about in terms of density estimation, you can think of living in this right-hand column here. So this will be the focus going forward. This does not mean that the other side is not interesting as well, but rather that I see more potential and more things to do here on this side. So let's spell out the assumptions that go into this type of anomaly detection explicitly. Firstly, we assume sorry, I can't talk anymore. Firstly, we assume rarity, meaning that the signal isn't so strongly produced that it could be observed without doing anything else. So essentially, that the overall probability of observing an anomalous event is low compared to observing normal data. Then we assume overlap, meaning essentially that in all variables, in all parts of phase space, there is also a standard model background. So essentially saying the new physics signal is not an outlier, but is covered in all distributions by the standard model. And the first two are relatively weak assumptions. The other two are relatively strong assumptions. The strong assumptions are that the signal is resonant, firstly, and that we know in which variable it should be resonant. So we don't need to know the exact position it needs to be resonant in, so we can scan over this variable, but we at least need to be able to pick a resonant signal variable, typically an invariant mass. And it has like a compact shape in this variable. And the final assumption, and of course also in general valid for physics data, is the background distribution is smooth enough that we can find sideband regions to extrapolate the background into the signal region. And this will allow us some type of anomaly detection. Overall, let's quickly look how this slots into an analysis, because again, this is a machine learning lecture, so we're focusing on the machine learning tools to solve a specific problem. But you should never lose sight of the bigger picture. So what we're doing is we create an anomaly score that isolates anomalous data, but once this anomaly score is trained and applied, the job does not end there. We also need to estimate the background from the data, do comparisons of the background to the observation, and do a statistical analysis. And there are properties that an anomaly detector can have that make this part, the anomaly detection itself, work very well, but that interfere with these downstream tasks. And when developing machine learning tools for anomaly detection, keeping in mind this problem is useful because it makes it into a better tool for the overall analysis. Okay, Ben already introduced the Lhc Olympics, so I'll be very brief about it. It was a publicly available data set consisting of a set of R&D events and 3 black boxes to work with. And essentially the choice of signals was motivated by this type of anomaly search that I've lined out here. If you want to mentally visualize it, I think you can think of the following decay structure. So we have quark coming in with the intermediate resonance of a C prime that decays into 2 further new physical theory particles, the X and the Y, that goes into decay into a pair of quarks. And already that is a relative large space of searches that is difficult to cover for the anomalies. That is difficult to cover for the experiments without the use of anomaly searches, because we have 3 free parameters with the mass of the X, the mass of the C, and the mass of the Y. Plus we have the information that the X and the Y are 2-prong decays. So the phase space that needs to be covered by an experimental search, just covering 3 masses in X, Y, and C, is already relatively large. So even if anomaly detection is only limited to this very small part of space, it can already be useful. Of course, the wider space of models a search simultaneously can cover, the more useful it is. But if there are a few free parameters, it already starts to be useful. So we're talking here about the R&D data set, just to show you some of the features that are stored in the data set. We're storing the invariant masses of the jets, the differences of the masses, and some information about the substructure. That, of course, makes it very easy to see these type of resonances. So this should be easy to find. When we now go to the challenge data sets, so the data sets that people had to work on as part of this Lhc Olympics to see if they could find anomalies, the first challenge data set was actually same topology as the R&D data set, just with slightly different masses. So you would think that this is easy to find, given that it's so similar. The second black box was empty. The third black box was very difficult in the sense it had two signatures that were competing, and one needed to reconstruct both to find new physics. So Ben already talked about the results, so I will be very brief here. There was a number of techniques that were able to discover black box type 1. There were a few positives for black box 2, and black box 3 is still an open question. So we already talked about it. I think we have some exciting new ideas to solve it, which would be an excellent outcome for this. Okay. How can we build an anomaly score? And the first big way of building an anomaly score is to try to look in regions of the data where the background density is low. So we can think of an anomaly score. We want it to be high, where there's a high chance that the data point is a new physics signal. So we take 1 over the background density. How can we approximate? Oh, that is not good. I'm sorry, pressed the wrong button. Okay. Okay. How can we approximate the background density? Well, we can again use the autoencoder. So I don't need to repeat the introduction of the autoencoder. We start from images, map them to a latent space, and map from the latent space back to the data space. And we train it by, for example, just minimizing the Euclidean pixel-wise difference between an input image and an output image. Why should an autoencoder be useful for this task? You can think of it the following way. And you probably even have a nicer analogy than I do. But the way I usually think about it is if an autoencoder sees a certain type of data during the training phase, it will learn the compression strategy for this type of data, and it will learn the decompression strategy for this type of data. So the encoder and the decoder will learn the most efficient compression for images of cats, for example. And if we then, in the application phase of the autoencoder, pass another type of image to it. So we train it on only images of cats, and then we show it a picture of a bus. Then the assumptions that go into the efficient compression of a cat image and the efficient decompression of a cat image do not hold anymore, because there are different shapes in the bus that one would need to put together. And in the end, you arrive at the bus at an output that will be some hybrid between a bus and a cat. This is very good. It sounds bad, but it's very good, because what it means is that we can take the difference between the output image and the input image as an anomaly score. It will be low for the type of data we have seen in the training phase, and it will be high for types of data we have not seen in the training phase. This is exactly what we want for an anomaly score. We want to train on background data and then flag anything that is not background data as an anomaly. So this sounds great, and we were very happy about it. And both David and I wrote a paper about this, came out on the same day, but different papers, but we came to the same conclusion, namely that the autoencoder, due to this compression, is a good way of looking for new physics. The example we used is top quark identification. I already convinced you that top tagging is probably the most useful benchmark to look at different new physics models. So what we compare here is the ROC curve, so the signal efficiency again on the horizontal axis, the background rejection again on the vertical axis, looking at an autoencoder that was trained only on QCD jets, so only on light quark and gluon jets, and then tested on top jets. And we see we have a non-trivial amount of discrimination. We also see that this discrimination, so the ability of that we have to classify these tops, is also an order of magnitude worse than the targeted tagger. This is the usual trade-off for anomaly detection, that it's not as powerful as something that looks for a specific theory, but that if it has the advantage of being sensitive to a larger number of specific models. The different colors are just a scan of the size of the latent space, and it turns out something on the order of 20 to 30 is a decent size for the latent space in this case. But the point is really just a proof of concept. An autoencoder is able to see anomalies. So this was very exciting. However, there's one big problem, or there's several problems with autoencoder-based anomaly detection. And the first one that we stumbled into is that there is a bias due to the complexity of the image. And complexity of the image, that is again a very abstract word. How do you visualize it? Just think of the pictures we had of tops and QCD jets before. The average top image just has a larger number of pixels that are different from 0 than the average QCD image. Also, the top image had like this 3-prong structure. The QCD image is just had like this 2-prong structure. So it turns out that this matters for the quality of the encoding and decoding process that the autoencoder learns, because it's harder to compress and decompress a complex image than it is to do the same thing for an image that only consists of a handful of pixels. So this we saw in the master's thesis a while ago, and we can very easily visualize this problem the following way. If we only use QCD examples for training, and we look at the anomaly score, and we compare the anomaly shape for QCD here in gold to the anomaly shape for top events in blue, then we see the peak of the top distribution goes towards the right, so towards more anomalous. The problem is when we do the opposite, we train on only top quarks, and still the top examples will look more anomalous. So this is a problem that has captivated particle physicists for 2 or so years. And I don't want to go into the details of the results here, but there is a very recent paper by a group by Tillman et al. That using normalized autoencoders, so a specific type of autoencoder architecture, this can be overcome. And the top jet is then anomalous if one trains on the QCD sample, and the QCD jet is then anomalous if one trains on the top sample. And I don't want to say more about this result, because we have the actual author of the normalized autoencoder that these physicists picked up here in the audience. So I was very happy to know you. And just to emphasize again, this solves a real issue that was troubling anomaly detection for a while. And it's very cool that this can be directly applied. So thank you very much. Okay. Let's move on. There's another problem with autoencoder-based anomaly detection. Here in this very nice paper phrase, says perfect density models cannot guarantee anomaly detection. And the observation here is that if we have a one-dimensional density distribution, and we have 2 data points A and B. So we could think of this as the background density. Then if we look at this distribution, and if we see the data point A, we would clearly say A is more anomalous than B, because A lives in a region of lower background density. And if we say we do anomaly detection looking for regions of low background density, then of course A would be more anomalous. But what happens if we apply a monotonic transformation to this function? This is the monotonic transformation set given here, and A and B just lie on different points, but it's really just a monotonic rescaling of this shape. Well, the result is the plot here on the right-hand side, where the point B is now at the region of lower background density than the point A. This is not a very complex statement. It's similar to saying, if we do a phase space, if we do a variable transformation, we need to take the Jacobian determinant of the change of variables into account. And if we don't take this change of variables Jacobian into account, then it changes the meaning of what is rare or not. However, this means that any background density-based anomaly detection will be very explicitly sensitive to the variables that one uses to set it up. We will learn in the second lecture by David about likelihood ratio-based anomaly detection that does not have this issue, or at least to a lesser degree. Of course, you could say, okay, if I take the Jacobian into account, this would not be a problem. But the problem is that you don't know which variable to start from if you want to do a model-independent physics search. Of course, if you know which variable to start from, then this is fine, and you could take the Jacobian into account. Okay, this is the first lecture. We're closing on time, and we have a few minutes for discussion, or early break if you're exhausted. So let me just very briefly mention one last direction that I think is fairly exciting. And for this, we again need to think back to the very beginning of this lecture. And one of the things I said was that the LHC has a data collision rate of 40 megahertz, so of one collision every 25 nanoseconds. But we can only store data with a rate of 1 kilohertz, so 1,000 events per second. And this is because the storage capacity that we have is limited, also the I/O and so on. So one interesting strategy, and this processing down from 40 megahertz down to 1 kilohertz, of course, does not act in a random way. That would be very stupid. But it acts in such a way that we define algorithms, so-called triggers, that are sensitive to a specific predefined property of what we find interesting about new physics. So, for example, we record all the events with 2 muons above a certain energy threshold. We record all the events with a couple of jets above a certain energy threshold. We record all the events with missing energy. This is great. And this is very useful for many specific searches for new physics, or of course for measurements. But if we are now starting to develop this capacity of building anomaly detectors to find new physics, it's only natural to also think about whether we can directly use them in the hardware. So this picture is just Xilinx FPGA evaluation board that one can use for this. But essentially, modern FPGAs are cheap and powerful enough to have microsecond level decision making, so fast enough to be run in the trigger, and complex enough to run a neural network with something like 2 or 3 hidden layers directly on the data stream. So we're seeing a development towards anomaly detection in the trigger. And of course, if you have an idea for an algorithm that is extremely fast, or that does anomaly detection extremely well, this might be a very good way of directly applying it to a much larger data set than one sees after the trigger. I think with this, I come to a conclusion. So I hope that in my part of the lecture, at least so far, David will have his own closing, I could convince you that particle physics is an amazing playground to do machine learning. And there's a list of topics provided here. We've covered a few of them in more detail. We covered a few others in less detail. But this wealth of new results should not give you the wrong impression. This overall field is still developing extremely rapidly. And if you have a good idea, you can have a large impact. So I think there's many opportunities to get started with this, to apply the different techniques, or, you know, it's Lego pieces, so you can stack them up to different problems. And it's important maybe not to limit yourself to a specific type of algorithm, but to really see the potential that we have in, we can encode our physics knowledge in the networks, we can encode problems we care about in the loss function, and we can think about things in a more statistical way than maybe the traditional physics training led us to believe. And I think this is a very good thing to keep in mind in the direction of, it's a lot to learn in the beginning, but I think right now is still a great opportunity to go into developing these things. Okay, with this, I think I want to thank you. So I'm very happy to have been here. It was a great pleasure, and you've been great students. I've tried to remember this, but I can't. Dankzing u havandase kamsa habadenida.
Okay, so questions? Actually, I have two questions. Can you go back to the slide that you compare the different ROC curve for the number of the size of the, yeah, over there, yes. Yes, yes. The size of the latent space. So here, the ROC curve is improving in terms of the size of the latent space, like 34. Yeah, also.
It's improved. It's a bit misleading. So it shows that improves a bit with the size of the latent space. Yes. So this is not, sorry, this is not the performance of the autoencoder in the sense of its reconstruction quality. The reconstruction quality goes continuously up with the size of the latent space. This is already the anomaly detection property. So you need to find the sweet spot between you have enough variables so that it can learn something useful, and you have too many variables so it can just learn any distribution without without having to compress, and thereby without enforcing finding the anomaly.
So in this example, what would be the number of the independent, kind of independent substructure variables, the size of the?
This is trained on images. So
yes,
the data input is 1,600 dimensional.
No, I mean that to quantify, to understand this size of this latent space. Yeah. If, for example, to quantify the Q series, if I just need 3 independent substructure variables, then maybe the latent space just needs 3, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
you make the correct observation that this relatively simple setup with a convolutional autoencoder is not able to learn a physics-motivated, efficient representation of the chat as we would have with QCD variables. You're right about that, yes. This is a true statement, I agree. You could do an autoencoder on n-sub-chat-index variables directly, then you would have that baked in. But if we work with a small number of observables, the techniques that David is going to talk about are actually more promising.
And second question, in the example of the Lhc Olympics for the different the event diagrams. Oh, yes. In the previous one, for example.
Oops.
Yes. And here, did you turn on the ISR and the matching jet, or just a pattern level without the matching?
That's a very good question that I think you can pose to David, who ran the simulation. Do you remember it?
Sorry, the question was whether we turned on ISR and did matching or not? Yeah, no, we didn't. We just did leading order. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Thank you.
I have a question about the anomaly detection. So why shouldn't we infer anomaly from based on the Gaussian distribution that we have on the latent space instead of using decoder as well?
Okay, very good question. Honestly, the answer is I just skipped that this option exists, but this is perfectly valid. So let me be a bit more careful. Standard autoencoders don't have a well-defined distribution in the latent space. So with a standard autoencoder, you can't do what you're proposing. But what you can do, and this is actually a very nice segue into something I skipped here. But with the variational autoencoder, you are right. You can look at the latent space distribution, and instead of trying to transform back and building an anomaly score, you could look at how far the projected data point is away from a Gaussian with the mean 0 and the width of 1. You're very right about that. It turns out in practice, or at least in all the experiments I've seen in particle physics, that the performance is very much the same as the performance with a standard autoencoder. So nobody bothered to do it, with one big exception. If we think about applying machine learning in the trigger stage, I've sketched it. The problem we have is really fitting in the network architecture into this device. Well, not in the picture, but you know what I mean. And the big advantage of your proposal is that in that case, after training and for the evaluation phase, you can drop the second half of the network because you only need the latent space for defining the anomaly observable. And that means it's it's half as big, so it fits better onto the architecture. So for this type of application, actually an R-score that is exactly what you proposed is It's performing almost as good as the full autoencoder, but it's much cheaper to calculate, so here it becomes useful. Very good observation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's have a question time during the coffee break.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Maybe let me make the last statement that, of course, if any questions show up, email me, ping me. However, I'm happy if anything comes up that was confusing afterwards. Thank you very much.